a quick word about our moderator, Anya Schiffrin, because if it wasn't for her, we wouldn't be sitting here today, because it was 9 months ago at her conference, one of her many conferences, but this was on saving journalism in October 2022, when Anya said, let's stay, everyone should just, who's interested in staying behind and wants to do something further, come back the next day, and about 5 or 6 of us did. And it was at that meeting where we said, let's think about a conference in the Global South. And I sort of naively put up my hand and said, okay, well, I'm prepared to organize it. But really, Anya, it was made such a special effort to be here today. Just from my side, personally, a special thank you to you, and really appreciate everything you've done to help make this conference happen. And over to you. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Michael. And thanks to everyone, the incredible conference, the hospitality. I've spent so much time in South Africa. I'm really glad to be here again. My journey with the code started in the fall of 2020 during the pandemic. I was teaching at Columbia, working with Francesca, who's in the room, and I was looking for encouraging things for our students to work on at a time when the world was really in trouble. And I asked one of them, hey, I hear Australia's doing this interesting bargaining code. Can we start looking into it? So in fall of 2020, we began looking at the bargaining codes. We'd been working with Konrad Adenauer on solutions for saving journalism and looking at policies all over the world. And we came to the view that the bargaining codes weren't necessarily the solution for everything, but they were a good start and really worthy of study. And then we started to find other academics and scholars around the world who were interested in the topic. And since then, we've really been a sort of happy group. We're on Zoom regularly, we're publishing regularly, and we're trying to sort of keep updated as to what's happening. So Phaedra and Taylor Owen at McGill University in Canada have been keeping us informed about Canada. Courtney is really the expert now in what's happening in the US and California, as well as the rest of the world. You speak every language, you go everywhere. Jonathan has become a real collaborator in the UK, and many of his colleagues are in the room. And then I just met Alexis in Zurich recently. So this conference has been fantastic because we've really been wondering about Indonesia and Malaysia and India. And it's really interesting to hear all the perspectives from the African colleagues. And I think in this panel, we're going to focus on 3 things. The first is an update on the UK, Canada, and the US. We're going to talk a little bit about something we will really focus on in the breakout, which is how can the codes be improved? What can we do better than Australia? And finally, the next phase, which Alex is involved with, and I'm starting to look at, is how is the valuation being done? Some people in the audience have asked how to get information, and we've all been writing a lot, and I've been publishing a little bit in Pointer and Tech Policy Press with updates. So if I can send you more information about the different countries. I think that some of the comments that have been made about the threats from big tech, that's a theme that we've seen all over the world. They've threatened to pull news in many countries. I just wrote an article recently about Spain, which was dropped from Google for 8 years and survived. The small publishers were hit more than the large ones. And there's been a bunch of work done by different people about what happens when you do get dropped. Italy, there have been many countries, I think Switzerland, where Google and Facebook or Google or Facebook have said, we're gonna drop you. So the threats are ongoing. And I think the point about sticking together is really important. But there's been a lot of activity in Canada, so I thought that maybe Phaedra could just bring us up to speed on the C-18 bill.
So thank you, Anya. So for those who maybe don't know, so Canada went a bit of a different route than Australia did and many of the other countries who are looking at this are going, where we didn't take the perspective that we should go the competition route. We're looking at it more from a regulatory perspective. So the CRTC, Canada, I like to say, is like 5 oligopolies in a trench coat. Our Competition Act is not that strong. So the CRTC route was definitely the better way to do it. But Canada's been looking at journalism and how to support the journalism industry for a few years. I mentioned yesterday that in 2019, there was a package of policies that were introduced that included a labor tax credit for journalism outlets, a digital news subscription tax credit as well, and a new category of charity was created under our Charity Act. And so creating this bargaining code was one of a handful of things or packages that were introduced to support journalism. And it was actually something that was put to public consultation a couple years ago. We were asked by the government, should we go the bargaining code route or should we look at a public fund? And the public decided that, and I think it was widely agreed upon that going a public fund route and having the government set up a fund that they would administer and that sort of thing, it's problematic for a whole host of reasons. And so they decided to go that route instead. And maybe I'll just talk a little bit about what the Online News Act is, because I do think it's unique in this landscape of bargaining codes. So definitionally, the Online News Act compels digital platforms of a certain size to enter into financial agreements with publishers for news made available on their platforms. The main policy lever that we're quite proud of is the exemption criteria. The exemption criteria, I think, illustrates a comment you made yesterday, which was that if it's not public, it's not kosher. And I think the exemption criteria really illustrate that. So you can only be exempt as a news intermediary from designation if you report the details of the deals that you're entering into with news publishers and meet all of the following criteria. So these criteria may be interesting in the context of the principles we're going to discuss after the break. So one, digital news intermediaries have to provide for fair compensation to the news businesses for the news content that's made available on their platforms. They have to ensure that an appropriate portion of the compensation is used by the news businesses to support production of local, regional, and national news. They do not allow corporate influence to undermine the freedom of expression and journalistic independence enjoyed by news outlets. They contribute to the sustainability of the Canadian news marketplace. They ensure a significant portion of independent local news businesses benefit from them. They contribute to the sustainability of those businesses, encourage innovative business models in the Canadian news marketplace. And finally, they have to involve a range of news outlets that reflect the diversity of the Canadian news marketplace. So great, this became law a few weeks ago, and now the CRTC has 6 months to figure out the rules. So you would think, great, we all live happily ever after and perfect. But as many of you have probably seen, Google and Facebook took this as an opportunity to say they're going to block news in Canada. So yeah, that's not great. And we're kind of thinking of it as, probably a warning shot to other countries who are considering similar bills. Was just having a conversation with Emma that, it's one thing for Australia to do something like this, because Australia, you're kind of off in the ocean. But Canada, we're right on the border with the United States. And so, yeah, I think it's a whole other level of sensitivity when it happens in Canada.
Didn't some of the government say, if you block our news, we're going to stop advertising on the platforms?
Yeah, exactly. So the federal government has stopped advertising on the platform. So have some provincial governments as well. So Quebec last week, British Columbia today, actually, I think, as well as a handful of fairly large businesses in Quebec as well have pulled advertising. So So yeah, it's an ongoing battle.
So it's a bit like Australia, where the threats backfired because people said, we feel bullied. We don't like that. Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you.
What's happening in the
So
UK?
in the UK, so there's various things that we can say with a lot of certainty and some things we can say with absolute uncertainty about what the hell is going on in the UK. I'm pretty certain there will be a bargaining code, 99.9% certain. I'm certain it will cover some platforms, it will cover some publishers, it will require some kind of negotiation with some kind of outcome and some kind of regulatory oversight. But there's a lot of uncertainty in the mix as well. So why is that? So that's because we are taking a different route again. So we've seen the Australian model, we've seen the Canadian model, we'll talk about the US and the California models. In the UK, we have a government that is very keen to assert its global independence. As you know, we pulled ourselves out of our biggest international club, the European Union, and immediately decreased our global influence by about 50% in the biggest act of national self-harm in our proud history. So the government is one thing that means that the government can do now is we don't have to follow the Digital Services Act or the Digital Markets Act, which are the main EU regulatory approaches. So the government wants to show that they're independent, they do their own thing. At the same time, we are trying to strike trade deals with the other big economies of the world, principally the US. So we've got a really complicated relationship here with the US big tech. Are we really going to take them on or not? The government wants the UK to be a centre for tech innovation. To that extent, it wants to push back on the power of the US companies. At the same time, if Washington says, well, hang on, you're not going to get the trade deal you want, that's going to push things in the other way. So we've got this bill called the Digital Markets, Competition and Consumers Bill, the DMCC bill. It's a big bill. It's a 300-page piece of legislation. It's halfway through Parliament at the moment, and at the moment it's going well. The government is behind it and the opposition parties are behind it. And the platforms are not really blocking it. I think they're playing a much more long-term game, because this bill actually poses a much bigger threat to them, I think, than a simple news bargaining code. This bill proposes tough new economic regulation of the platforms across a whole range of industries where they have an impact. It will regulate them in relation to travel, retail, all the industries that have been disrupted by big tech over the last 10, 15 years. And it will create a new regulator. I think Vibod mentioned the recommendation from the Indian Parliamentary Subcommittee to create a new digital markets unit. Well, that's what we're going to get. We're going to get a digital markets unit within the Competition and Markets Authority in the UK. So the DMU will be a new, very powerful regulator. It will have the power to fine platforms supposedly up to 10% of global turnover for non-compliance with a range of new rules that will come forward. But why is there uncertainty? Well, there's uncertainty because the bill is essentially, it's very long, but it's basically just an enabling piece of legislation. It creates this new regulator and gives it these powers, but it also gives the regulator all the responsibility for deciding which platforms, which conduct requirements, and when it comes to news, which publishers will benefit and how will the regime be constructed. So we have a lot of uncertainty at the moment. The bill is going through Parliament, it's going well, probably it will finish before the end of the year or early in 2024, but then everything passes over to the regulator, and we suspect that's when the platforms will start to get much more aggressive and be probably trying to play a very long game, because the regulator has to consult. It has to consult on which platforms to designate, and then on the conduct requirements, and then on the sanctions. And anytime it wants to actually investigate the platform, there's a complicated set of procedures it has to go to. The platform can block investigations, it can bring forward various defenses. If they award sanctions, the platforms can appeal. So it could be, I have to say, 3, 4, 5 years before we actually see real movement. But the big question, I guess, for us is whether or not in the shadow of that, whether that's a sufficient threat that, as we've seen in other countries, the platforms come to the table and think, okay, we'll get on with it. We'll do some deals with some news publishers, and maybe they'll still be hopeful that that will help to give them a better PR and might mitigate some of the other threats that they face. So there's definitely big stuff going to happen. I can't tell you exactly what or when.
Yeah. And I think what we came out clearly in the conversation yesterday is in countries where news outlets are pretty desperate, they're making deals, even if they're not that favorable, just because it's faster. And that feels like part of the South Africa story. The U.S. has really become an outlier in everything around the world. And I wouldn't say in a good way. One of the things, and sometimes at conferences, I almost feel like we shouldn't be there because we're not part of a lot of these global conversations anymore. And I think that journalism policy is a really good example of that. We really haven't been able to do many of the big federal legislation that other countries have looked at. It was so clear when we were writing Saving Journalism that so many countries, we heard about Malaysia, Indonesia, many countries during COVID made emergency funds available for journalists, Australia, Canada, range of packages. In the US, we've really devolved almost to cities. So one of the things that, we've been working on is city advertising going to journalism. The one thing that we do have on our side is, we've had the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act that hasn't really gone anywhere, but Courtney will brief us on the reintroduction. One thing we've got going for us is that California is so big. And we always say to ourselves, California has the right to do their own emission standards for cars. And when they did that, Detroit ended up just following the California standard for the whole country because it was easier. So one thing we keep asking ourselves in the US is, can that be the same with tech regulation? If California passes something, they have a good privacy law, will that sort of start to happen around the rest of the country? And is it, partly because it's just easier for Google and Facebook? If you're doing it for California, you may as well do it for everybody else. So I think Courtney will talk to us about the proposal in California, as well as in the US and where that stands right now.
Yeah, so right now, the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act, the JCPA, has been reintroduced in Congress, and it's one of the rare pieces of legislation that is bipartisan, very rare. The California law is kind of on hold right now because they've decided to make it a 2-year law to give themselves more time to figure out the contours of the specifics. It's basically a news media bargaining code. It will give journalistic organizations the right to collectively bargain and alleviate some of the antitrust provisions that would prevent that sort of bargaining. I think what's been really interesting, though, is not only how far we are behind in terms of supporting journalism, but also in regulating the tech companies that have an impact on media systems around the world. And I first got interested in actually in the 6 months leading up to the passage of the Australian law and wanting to understand from a press freedom perspective what this type of law would mean, and really discovering this divide between the internet freedom, digital rights community and the press freedom community. And so I was working at the Committee to Protect Journalists, and then pitched this idea to the Center for International Media Assistance to do a report on making big tech pay for the news they use. And what are the infrastructural requirements that you need for that? And what are the contours of the policy that you need to protect that? So it's been great to then have, done this learning around the world, because frankly, a lot of countries are a lot more advanced than the US is. And so as I've been talking with offices in Congress and in the California Assembly, some of the key principles that we've been talking about, and which you can now see in the legislation, are transparency. So this came up before, right? What level of transparency should we require for commercial deals? Australia has 0 transparency requirements. Canada has transparency requirements to report to a regulator. And so I think it's about striking that balance between allowing enough transparency to allow oversight and auditability. And that should apply not only to the deals that are made between
the platforms and the media companies, which they are required to be reported to the FCC and the Federal Communications, our entity that oversees communications in the JCPA. And that would then allow us to have some level of insight, but won't necessarily give every detail. I think we also should be pushing for greater transparency into all of the types of funding that these tech companies are giving to journalistic organizations, because we're seeing this tension, as we've heard about over the past 2 days, about let's do these deals on the side while this legislation is happening. And so trying to see whether we can get in some transparency requirements for the tech companies to report all of the types of support that they're getting in one area. Because you heard about his report yesterday. We dig all over to try to find out how much funding is happening, and to ask media organizations should also require some level of transparency. The JCPA, there's a lot of concern about the local versus national, large versus small media. And so there's actually a size cap of 1,500 employees for a news organization to be able to take advantage of this legislation. That would essentially mean that 3 major news organizations, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and New York Times, wouldn't benefit under this. And that is designed because there is a lot of opposition to this idea of, in our country, we have a lot of hedge funds that own media. And so we don't want this to just line the pockets of people who are investing for profit versus for the public interest. And so there are requirements about needing to spend a significant percentage on journalism. I think that's been challenging. And I've had a lot of discussions with legislators, to some of the things we discussed yesterday. Yes, you want this to go to journalism, but if you don't have the website to deliver that journalism, if you don't have, I used to work at the Committee to Protect Journalists, if you don't have the safety training for journalists to go out and do investigative reporting, or have the online tools to do reporting safely, how do you think about all the things that go into supporting journalism and the news? So right now, the JCPA does have a preponderance of support having to go to journalism. I think that the way that they're creating these there's a lot of concern also about whether this will be a partisan bill, and how do you prevent this from being either a must carry, so having to carry things that are not even journalism, or being able to be manipulated to have viewpoint discrimination. So there's very explicit language in here to try to mitigate both of those concerns. And then there's been a lot of opposition to this idea of giving kind of copyright. Our copyright office decided that we do not need additional copyrights to protect news content. And this bill does explicitly address the issue of AI and the fact that licensing and thinking about how, the news media should be able to bargain for the use of their content. So I think, it's not going to save all of journalism. It's an important step. I think we need to see it as part of a package. And with the California law, we do hope to see it pass, I think, more quickly. But now that it's become a 2-year bill, that's not going to be taking place as quickly. And so I think it's a little bit less clear in that domain.
And will JCPA come up for a vote this year?
One can only hope.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, it's really tough. I'm not a congressional prognosticator, and our Congress, is a very challenging body to work with. But again, this is a really rare bill where there is bipartisan support for this.
Yeah. I think you've teed us up very nicely for the principles, because I think that I don't want to speak for the group, but I think certainly where Courtney and I are in agreement is that transparency, making sure money's spent on journalism, making sure that local news is involved, I think are all really important. And I know, I've had conversations with Rod Sims and others who don't feel transparency is key, but I think for all of us, it's really important. The size cap is interesting. I mean, I think another way of doing it would not be size cap, but more what do you cover, or is it for news? I do want to flag, Courtney's just got a new job with Barry Lynn at Open Markets, and they published a report last year about the New York Times and I think other publications that are getting very significant amounts of money already from Google, completely privately. I think that part of what's exciting about this conference is that in your countries, you will be able to hopefully improve on these laws. And I was wondering if Jonathan or Phaedra had any other improvements that they think are important to be included in future iterations of these laws, or has Courtney summed up everything that you...
I mean, I think the challenge, like I said, the challenge in the UK is we don't have the law, and even when we have the law, we won't have the detailed code because that will follow through regulation. I mean, I work for an organisation that works with small independent news providers, like many of you in the room. We definitely want to make sure that even the very smallest news providers, as long as they're registered professional organisations, should be able to benefit. If they're putting content online, or their content is being put online, they're in the same boat as the New York Times, The Guardian, the biggest media in the world. But then that does require some guarantee that they have got decent professional standards. So in our country, we do have a system of independent self-regulation, which I think is a good benchmark for that. But I also recognise in many other countries, you don't necessarily have independent press councils. So I think that's why we want to talk through the principles about, well, how do you get the balance right between requiring professional standards? So I think the trick about answering your question, Anya, is it's not going to be the same in every at the detailed level. I think it's so context sensitive about the institutions and traditions and protections that you've got. So we can do we could do the perfect solution for the UK, but that wouldn't be the perfect solution for Canada or the US or Switzerland.
Yeah.
And certainly not for Lesotho or Côte d'Ivoire or other countries that are represented here. So I think that's why I'm excited about later this morning, we'll talk about the principles and see if that's where we find agreement, and then we can work down country by country.
Yeah, and on the trade agreements, I mean, at Courtney's last conference, we've been talking a lot about how the U.S. is trying to put protections for tech companies in the bilateral agreements. Since your excellent discussion on that, I've met with Lori Wallach, who used to work with Ralph Nader at Citizen Action, and they've been able to push some of that back by really flagging that to people in the executive office. But, what will happen in the future now that the WTO is pretty much dead, that remains to be seen, how much the U.S. is going to try to keep protecting the companies. There's more to say on taxes, but I guess we won't do that right now. Phaedra, any other things that you wish Canada hadn't done or that you'd encourage other people to do?
Well, one conversation that we're having now is whether or not our public broadcaster, the CBC, should be included as part of this. I mean, the CBC has a long history in Canada, to your point about institutions being very context specific, has a long history in Canada, was initially set up in the 30s to bridge language divides and regional divides and that sort of thing. But we're having a conversation now, or would like to start having a conversation around what the role is of a public broadcaster in the digital age. But, it's an institution that gets public funding already. And so maybe, having it not be included as part of something like this.
Yeah. And that came up a lot in Australia. So I think another thing that's happening all over the world is that publishers are already getting consultants and lawyers in to make estimates for how much they think that they're owed. And this is being done quite quietly. I think Google is making their own studies as well. And I think in many cases there will be these, and already are, these conversations that are happening between the publishers and big tech. There's obviously a lot of consultants in this world who specialize in valuing damages. And they have many, many ways of calculating what is owed. You can look at the harms perspective of how much advertising was taken away. You can look at the counterfactual if the platforms hadn't been there, what would be happening to the newspapers? There are obviously questions about, where would the smaller outlets have been without the traffic from the platforms versus the bigger ones. So there's lots of different measurements that can be used. And in general, the publishers associations, not in general, everyone I've talked to, they're not sharing these numbers. And they're giving a range of reasons for why they're not sharing. I know Daryl and I have talked about, as you all know, South Africa is a very active competition authority. And, the worry is that if these numbers are being shared between publishers, they could be accused of collusion. In some cases, it's simply proprietary information. They're going into, I quoted the News Media Alliance in the U.S. saying, we're going into arbitration and we're using those numbers for private arbitration. So we're not sharing them. So it was obviously very interesting when I read a reference somewhere to the work that Alexis has been doing with Fair Consulting, which is run by a very well-respected behavioral economist in Switzerland. And your report was commissioned by the Swiss publishers. And they're taking a different perspective, which Alexis will describe to us. But the question is, how much value is being created by the combination of the platforms and the news outlets? So the fact that they work together is creating something bigger than the sum of the parts. And once you've worked out what that value is, news plus platform, then what are the publishers getting, and what is the gap between what they're getting and what they should be getting? So Alexis is going to go through some of their methodology. I'm not sure if you can talk about all of it, but you're going to talk about some of it. And that's going to be a very interesting discussion. So take it away, Alexis.
Thank you. Maybe some words about Switzerland, far smaller than Canada, US, and UK, really small country in Europe. But the interesting thing about Switzerland is they never want to be first, right? They want to do it right. So what they're doing actually is they're taking a view on the world and say we take the best out of it. And the second interesting thing about Switzerland is that every law has the possibility to go into referendum, because that's the Swiss identity. So everything that's discussed in Parliament has always the view of the public opinion in it, right? So it has to be understandable for the public. That's also interesting. And maybe the third thing is that media have a very important role, and this is the public and common understanding that media have a very important role for this functioning system. So Switzerland is really a good functioning country, and media have an important role because of these referendums, because you have to build the opinion with independent sources. So maybe this is what's on the table right now is an ancillary copyright law. It's right now in the discussion in the Parliament. And basically it works like this, that companies that reach, platforms that reach more than 10% of the population should pay a certain amount for the copyright law to an organization, then that distributes this money to the media. So that's. But the question is, and what's the fair share? What amount should be here? And this is what you mentioned right now. Then they asked us, because Ernst Fehr is a well-known professor in Zurich, and the Zurich University is world renowned for its research in economics. And they said, well, can you help us here to find the right number? What's the value of this media content, which should be remunerated? And this is actually where we started with our research. And what we do actually as a company, as a consulting company, we conduct, and this is where it comes from economics, we conduct a lot of experiments. So we always put people into experience and see whether this changes the behavior. So we said, well, let's, imagine a world where there is no media content in Google. What would it change with the behavior of the people? So what we did is we took a representative sample of the Swiss population. One group saw Google as it is. They had to conduct a Google search. And the other group saw a different Google, where we took out the media content, something that's threatened by Google in Canada and other states. So we did this in the experiment to see what is happening. If you just change one thing, and that's the media content, and you measure then the KPIs afterwards, you have a reason, you have a causal analysis. You can say because of the media content, the differences are like this. So that's basically what we did. And this is what I want to show you then. And this is what it looks like, right? It's German, sorry for that. But you have two Googles here. The Credit Suisse crisis was at the time we did that at its peak. So people are searching for this, and what you can see is the two Googles. You could click on it. It was, the experience was exactly the same as you have it in Google. And we were measuring certain things, how you click, but more important, we were measuring the behavior. But before I show you the figures, I would be interested actually. And maybe we have the Mentimeter voting. What you think is the fair share? What's the fair share that the platform like Google from its ad revenues? Yes, that was yeah, here. So with your smartphone, you can go over this QR code and you can vote. What's the fair share of Google's revenue that should be paid to the media publishers? Right? But you can also, with your laptops, go to menti.com and enter the code 27048592. And I hope this is working. And we have 8 votes here, so it looks good.
While they're voting, can I just make a point? Because,
yes,
one of the big challenges, I think, is this effort to determine whether Google and Facebook play a substitution effect, or if they're referring traffic. And it's this very narrow conception of value and how value should be determined. And what I think is so fascinating about your study is getting outside of that very narrow framework about value.
Thank you. And I'm going to come in here. I can't resist my blueberry muffin analogy, which I use in class, and some of you have heard. The way I explain this to my students is, imagine you are a baker and you have a beautiful big blueberry muffin that you sell. And somebody comes along and they take the top of the muffin, the really delicious, crunchy part with all of the blueberries. And you're left with the little dry part underneath. And then you can't sell it, because without the beautiful big top part, nobody wants it. That's what's happening, right? So Google is saying to the publishers, it's your fault, we're driving traffic. But really what's happened is they've taken the best part, which is what economists call cream skimming. So by taking the headline and the top news, you're kind of damaging the value. And I was just having an argument with someone from Google Spain recently who was saying, no, everybody reads to the end nowadays. They want to pay subscriptions. They'll read long stories. If anyone has seen that data, let me know, because I really have not seen that. Good. Anyway, so thanks for letting me get the blueberry. And I know Patricia's heard it a million times.
Yeah, meanwhile, we have the result. Right?
Thank
it's
you.
40%. That's the opinion here in the room. Well, that's quite much. 40% of the ad revenues. Yeah, maybe we can switch again to the presentation. Yes, exactly what you've been mentioning now, Courtney. It's what we measured at the beginning, actually, how much of the traffic that Google makes is redistributed, linked then to the publishers. So that's one thing we could see in the experiment. And my picture was a tart, actually. And from this tart that you have, or cake that you have, right, the largest piece actually stays within Google. So Google just gives away 47% of the traffic, and 53% of the traffic stays within the Google ecosystem. And I think this is referring to what you say. These are the numbers that we didn't find anywhere, which Google is not publishing, but we think that the algorithm is working towards to enlarge this piece of cake even further.
Can you explain a little bit more what you mean about the 53 and the 47?
Yeah, so 53 of if you do a search, right, 53% of the searches end with the Google search engine, where the result is already there. You don't have to click somewhere, which means, reversely, that I heard from Argentina, right? They told me that 80% of the traffic from the portals come from Google, right? But it's just 47% of the traffic. Google even has, far more traffic on its own side, where people just think it's enough, are satisfied with the headlines, with the news snippets or whatever that happens on the platforms. Is that answering the question? So that's one interesting finding from the study, right? So most of the traffic stays within the Google ecosystem and doesn't leave it. So that's important, because just the link traffic is the one that media can commercialize, where they can make money from. Second thing is what we see now in the results is, if you ask people then afterwards, are you satisfied with the results? Did you find what you're looking for? We see a difference with the Google with media and the Google without media. So Google, if you take out the media content, searches are less successful. And this is a significant result. Yeah? And this is just a one-time search. And in this one-time search, you see a difference between the two groups. But more important, and this is now really a key issue here, where are you searching information for? You go to places where you really trust in the information, where the information is complete, where you can orientate yourself, where it's unbiased and it's relevant. And what we see is, if you take out the media content, all these KPIs, all these important factors are dropping, right, in a one-shot experience. So what we see here is, if you take out the media, for the Canadian example, what Google really has a damage here, right? So reversely speaking, they profit from the media content in these very important factors, which are very important for the ecosystem. And then we measured the behavior, as I said, right? So after the experiment, after doing the search, we asked the people, so next search. Now you've seen Google with the first search, what are you doing now? And what happens here is that the people who have seen the Google without media leave Google, right? So the Google search engine is losing people here. And where do the people go? Well, they go directly to the online media, where you have the 55% increase. So what we see is actually it has a change on the behavior, a significant change on behavior if you take out the content here. So to sum it all up, in Switzerland, and it's probably in many countries the same, 86% of the population go to Google as a first station. Large proportion of the traffic stays within the ecosystem. People are more satisfied if they have media content in there. And we also asked the people, would you like to have this media content? Now you've seen it, would you like to have the media content in there? Interesting enough, 70% say yes, but 30% say no, right? So 30% would like to have a Google without media content. Fair enough, right? We know that there's people who are really skeptical about media. And what we see is this migration. So if you take out the media content, people migrate directly to the online media. And now comes the question, what's the value? And I have to explain that. That's the last slide here. And sorry, but it's a bit dense, but you can all download the study as well. So how did we calculate the value then? And it had to be easy, as I say, right? The chance to go into the referendum, so people have to understand the formula. And that's also very important here. And we said, well, a share must base on something. And we said, well, that's the money that Google makes here with search engine. In Switzerland, it's 1 billion Swiss francs a year. And not every search is an information-based search. There are also navigational searches, other searches, product searches. So we said 55%, and that's what we see in a lot of studies around the world, 55% of all searches are information-based. So which means that the revenue we're talking about is just 55%, is 550 million Swiss francs. And then, as we saw in the experience, 70% of the population are asking for, and they have a different behavior actually. 70% are looking for media content in the search engines, which makes them 380, nearly 400 million Swiss francs as a relevant market share, relevant revenue of Google. And then comes the question, what's the fair distribution? How much of this 400 million that Google makes with the help of media should go to the media? And well, that's difficult, right? And the economists that were in our scientific board, they said, well, what are they giving? So what's happening right now? And we said, no, that there's nothing, they're distributing nothing of the 400 million. It's zero. Then the economist said, no, that's impossible, right? if all the numbers that you have, right, Google sees it as well, right? It's an ecosystem. There must be a certain share that's distributed. We said, oh, no, that's not the case. Then they say, well, that means that's a dysfunctioning market, right? This means there's a monopoly in place, right? This means that Google is really abusing its power here, right? Are there any other markets where we could see a number which would be a fair share? So what we did is actually we took contracts that we have of Microsoft Bing with publishers. We looked at other markets in the advertising market where Google is in competition. And what we came up is, and that's the thing you could discuss, is a share of 30 to 40%, which is close to what you voted actually before. Yeah. Where we said this would be a fair share of this revenue, which would go then to the publishers, which leaves us then to a number of 154 million Swiss francs, which is about 15% of the overall revenues Google makes with searches. So that was the number that has been published. Is now presented to the parliament, and had they thought the first reactions we got is that seems to be very plausible here. Mm-hmm. And this is a model actually that you can use in other markets as well. Of course, you can do these experiments in other markets as well, but it's a very easy formula. And of course, you can also discuss it. The only reaction we got from Google from there was we have different figures.
Yeah. They downloaded your study straight away, didn't they?
Yes, they were the first ones. Yes.
But I think a global standard is emerging. There is a consensus that's coming across different countries. So maybe something for many of you in your country is to start commissioning these studies. And I think it's terrific that you've given us so much information. Before we turn to questions,
maybe one last thing.
Yeah, please.
If you take this 400 million, because you mentioned this before, the 400 million, right, that Google makes with the help of the media, what's the revenue that the publishers make? And we didn't publish this one, so maybe this stays in the room if it's possible.
No, I think maybe online, live streaming.
Okay.
So maybe not. Yeah.
It's a small proportion.
Yeah.
So from the direct traffic, so we calculated the direct traffic, right? And what the publishers make, right? It's this and this.
And that's the kind of data that should be made public.
Mm.
Right.
It will, yeah.
Data transparency in general. What are the publishers actually getting? And I think that point about the monopoly power that you've all made is really important, because it means that so many countries, as we talked about earlier, are too afraid. Because they need Google for so many things, and they don't want to alienate them. So shall we take some questions from the floor? I bet there's quite a lot of them. Yes.
Thanks. So much on music and license. To Alexis, I mean, this was a Google study, right? I mean, is there an attempt to look at other tech players, I mean, particularly Facebook, Meta?
Yeah, actually, we thought about doing it, and we also might do it. So in Switzerland, it's basically Google, Meta, and TikTok who have both this 10% who reach more than 10% of the Swiss population. Would be similar, but what we see is actually as an information source in Switzerland, at least, that Google is the far most dominant information source. And I think it's less than 50% of the people going to Meta platforms to inform themselves. So for information sources, but of course you could do the study for other platforms as well. Twitter would be interesting, but it's in Switzerland. It's not that important. Yeah.
Good. Should we take? Sorry.
I was just going to also say, I think we also need to do studies about what percentage of news content is being used in AI foundation models, because this is this landscape now, right? But we're moving into, there are a lot more platforms that are using news content for their valuable commercial products like OpenAI, Stability AI, et cetera. And so I think we also need to figure out how to value the news content that's being used in there. And I would say, especially because multilingualism came up, in low resource digital languages, Bahasa, many of the languages that have been mentioned here, my supposition is that news content is even more valuable. It's syntactically, really well, it's good foundation model. It's factual, has corrections attached to it. It includes metadata. And so we need to think about, and would love to talk to Alexis about, how do we study the value of news content in these large language models that are now underpinning many other platforms, so that we can also spread around who the news publishers are licensing their content to and getting paid by.
And then they're all going to be able to say, well, we're startups, so we're not making any money yet, so we don't really owe you anything.
But the foundation model, those who can afford to make the foundation models are multi-million-dollar companies, because it's very expensive and it's very resource intensive, which is another issue. But I think that we should be talking about the valuation both in terms of traffic and digital advertising, but also in terms of these large language models.
Yeah, I think Jonathan had a response, and then we'll go to Nick's.
Well, it's actually a kind of like additional question really to Alexis. I'm just really interested with the formula that you've developed in Switzerland. A lot of that is kind of fact sensitive. You did surveys, you looked at the Swiss market. Do you think is your sense is that's generalizable in other markets, or would you have to do similar analysis and maybe come out with very different formula?
Well, generally, I think it's applicable, and we did it for most European markets. We just did the calculation with this formula, right? And so that's possible. But what I mean, people are behaving differently. That we are behavioral economics, and this is context has an impact, and this has been mentioned in this conference. So there are contextual factors, which means it makes sense to do it in other markets as well, which we're right now doing. But we suggest that the core figures would be the same. That's what we expect, actually.
Just one final thought on that is that, again, for those of us who work with small publishers or we work in small markets, that's resource intensive, doing that kind of analysis. So we need to be talking to funders and others or bigger media to help to lean in to make it possible to do the maths.
That's right. Nick.
Thank you. I was going to maybe raise a point on the transparency, because I think it's very easy to say transparency, and there's obviously in the current legal framework in South Africa, on a narrow level, the implication is jail time, cartel behavior. That can be solved through an exemption and other sort of remedies, but there's also wider economic implications. And Daryl's been an economist longer than I've been alive, let's say. But what I think we think about is transparency between publishers. But complete transparency to the whole market, what it will actually do is let's use an example. If we know what Google values news at, Meta will know that as well. And that will be the ceiling to which Meta will value news. So it removes the uncertainty from the market. And what we really want here is a competitive process for news content. And we want that to be as competitive as possible. There must be a workable solution that isn't just complete transparency. And maybe that's, the regulator knowing it. It's to be discussed, but I think just throwing out the word transparency and everything must be known. There are real serious economic consequences to that. And the second thing is just to maybe push back on the statement that was made that the South African experience seems to be rushed to deals and not looking at the wider issues. I think what we see on that presentation is that publishers are being ripped off commercially. And these execs have a fiduciary duty to their companies. And if they don't correct, that being ripped off commercially, that's a real problem. And I think that can be done at the same time as, getting workable long-term solutions, and the thing is that South Africa might be doing it, but the US has been doing it, Europe's been doing it, and to think that the global South should be treated differently to Western countries, I think is incorrect.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are rushing to deals. I wouldn't just say here. and all over.
If I could just say also, so in Canada, the transparency is to the regulator. And then the additional level of transparency then is that the regulator has to do annual reporting around aggregate sums. We're suggesting that maybe reporting can happen a bit more regularly, but to your point.
And I mean, you have to have transparency, because some level of transparency, otherwise you don't know how to value the product. And so then you're not able to negotiate, even if you have the right to negotiate collectively. How do you do that in a meaningful way? One of the things that's interesting about the California model is that it has a legislatively mandated revenue sharing model versus a negotiation approach. And so I think we could look at that as well. Again, like if you have some level of information so that someone, the arbitrator or the regulator, has some perspective to understand whether there's fairness or not, I think we have to get some level of transparency there. And also, I think the media has to practice what it preaches, right? And this is one of the big problems I have in this space when we talk about big versus small media. Like, there are all of these deals being done, and we're demanding transparency from the tech platforms, but a lot of media organizations are not being transparent about their own deals. They're not actively engaging in transparency. And so we should see it on both sides to some level, and maybe not the precise sums, but certainly, annual reports, for example, or a page that shows like what money are we getting. We want to also know, how is our news media influenced by the money that they're getting from tech platforms.
And probably some kind of set aside for small outlets. Do we really only have 2 minutes left? We can go longer?
We can go longer. We can go
Great.
longer.
In that case, Alexis, and then we have a question, and then Alison, and then Helena.
Just one word to what Nick said.
Camille.
Well, after our study, we got a lot of reactions from publishers around the world, most of them European publishers, the biggest ones that already made deals with Google. And it's exactly what they said. It's the same what you said. We got ripped off after they saw these figures.
Great. In the back.
Yes, a couple of practical questions. You mentioned, I think it's Anna, at the very beginning, that you've got a group that you're discussing regularly. Is it a formal group, or is it just something informal? Is it academics only? I just wanted to know.
Oh, so we're totally informal, and we want everyone else to join who wants to join, and that's really what this meeting was about. I mean, we've been doing different Zooms and gatherings, and we've invited lots of people from around the world, but we're going to keep doing that. And anyone can join.
And there's also the Dynamic Coalition on Sustainability of News, Media, and Journalism, which is in the Internet Governance Forum, and anyone can sign up. We'll send around the link, but if you go to intgovforum.org, I think, and you can find the Dynamic Coalition, that is where we're trying to bring the digital internet governance community together with the news media to figure out how we govern the internet to make sure we have sustainability. And we do a lot of learning calls through that as well.
Thank you. And I was hoping, I don't want to create more work for Michael, but I was thinking maybe we could all send you articles, and you could send out a whole lot of links later for people that want to know more about what we've all been doing.
The second question, have we got any example where the big tech actually withdraw? They always threaten, but at the end, I mean, I've monitored at the end.
Yeah, so they came out of Spain for 8 years. They dropped Spanish news for 8 years, and I just wrote an article about that the other day. They shut off Facebook shut off some Australian news for a few days. I think it was fall of 2020. Canada, they practiced in February this year. So yeah, there are examples, and there have been some studies, including one of my PhD students did a great study of what happened when they changed the algorithms in 5 small countries and didn't warn anybody. I think it was Javier Sauras who did that. So that was, wasn't that Croatia and Cambodia? And there's been also some studies that we were talking about of by those other economists. So yeah, there are a bunch of studies, and we could add that to the reading list. And again, it seems to hit the small outlets, the digital natives, more than the large ones. But in some places, like in Latin America, where the publishers were able to really kind of beef up their own, website, they ended up benefiting, actually. But so it's a hard adjustment. It's painful at first, but people do adapt, is sort of the bottom line.
But if I could just add quickly, I think one concern that we have in Canada with Facebook is that Facebook's broader strategy is probably to be pulling back from news anyways. And so now they're just really going hard and making an example out of Canada.
Yeah, I mean, these codes are not going to save journalism forever. We're looking at a few years probably. Who knows?
But there's one thing maybe to add, right? So what we see from a user-centric perspective, right? It's exactly what people want. They want to have the news on one place. So the Google product, especially with having information in one place, is something that people love, right? So it harms the tech platforms if they draw out the news or the media. But the thing is, if this is a balanced ecosystem, there has to change something in the remuneration. But from a people-centric view, it's a perfect system.
Anya, just because of the number of questions, let's go till 12 o'clock as a hard deadline. So we've got another 10, 15 minutes at maximum, and then we'll just shift the program a bit.
Okay, great. Go ahead, Lawrence.
If I could start with an observation and then ask a question. In terms of transparency, first off, I as someone who has a deal, I remind you, we did sign a non-disclosure agreement as part of the term, and that's rather standard operating procedures. Secondly, I just make the point that not all deals with Google are equal, and that Google enters into different arrangements with different publishers, and that some of the funds that Google gives out are prescriptive in terms of what they can and can't be used for. So to talk about, you got X amount of money from Google, right? And you are only spending Y on journalism may be misleading to the panel, to the community, to the market. But now my question. Anya, you mentioned, after I was going to ask the question, the Spanish experience. And I wanted to basically ask the question of the Spanish experience, because I thought it was interesting that the Swiss experience was that Google, when news would cut from Google, that users went to media platforms directly. And I seem to remember reading in my Google search, trying to look at the Spanish model, that really only happened for legacy media, that El País, the largest daily newspaper, saw a huge spike. And I was particularly interested as an LGBT publisher in trying to find LGBT titles through Google search in Australia before there were any changes. And it was literally nigh impossible to find anything. So I was wondering if the Canadians were thinking about the impact, not just on the big five guys in the trench coats, but all the other little players who will be impacted more than, say, Torstar or the Globe and Mail.
Do you mean in particular with blocking of the news? Yes. I mean, totally. It's absolutely hitting the smaller publishers more, for your exact point. So totally.
Which is how Google's been able to divide and conquer, right? All over the world. We have these small publishers saying, we don't like this. And we keep reminding everybody that Emma worked with the smaller Australian publishers to help them get some money. Alison's been waiting very patiently. Please go ahead.
Sorry, I'm going to get on something else, but I just absolutely feel we have to respond to the statements of kind of facts that transparency are going to impact on competitiveness and are going to, create cartels. It's really quite illogical. And our concern that, we've got to protect competition between Google and Meta. I mean, really, is this our primary concern? Yeah. So, and this, these are public processes. These are not the result of private contract and agreement. These are publicly enabled processes. And the information that results from that is absolutely critical to assess the effectiveness of them in the public interest. Just the disclosure of the amounts is absolutely not going to, impact on the competitiveness of those different players. So I think that really just brings me to the point I was wanting to make about this wonderful panel and this wonderful examples we've had of progress that's been made in areas, and really juxtapose it against the panel we had, our Africa panel yesterday, and just ask what from this can we take to ensure that the benefits that we're seeing here are actually more universal than in these few jurisdictions, which have these long democratic traditions and constitutional protections and various things, which many of our countries don't have. And even where they do have, as in the case of South Africa, there are other, associated problems with vested interests. And I think one of the big things we need to think about is start, thinking about some of the global dimensions of governance of these big global platforms, and also the kind of valuations that we're doing. So, I think the valuations that have been done is really, really interesting, because one does want to get those financial valuations. But I think a lot of the work that's been done, like Mariano Mazzucato and people like that, are actually saying, and particularly pertinent to this area, what about the public value? And that is much more difficult to determine. And these are the questions around public value in terms of social welfare more broadly, but also the democratic public value of this. And so, sorry, my last point, that it actually takes me to the issue of why, in our contexts, public broadcasting and diverse media, electronic broadcasting, need to be brought into this, because their content is used, the news content is used on platforms. And, in South Africa, we're sitting in a situation where our public broadcaster, who has had a commercial hybrid model, does not have the kind of funding that, Canadian CBC has, is actually going into liquidation or business rescue. So, we have to think about it in this context. And perhaps what we're thinking of are about, the governance, the global governance of these globalized digital public goods, and the establishment of, functional solidarity funds. I don't mean these in terms of gifts, to the third world, but proper, administered funds that ensure that some of the problems that were associated with gathering of taxation in many of our countries that would simply be abused for personal purposes or whatever, can actually be distributed in such a way that they do go directly to public interest content in this case, or public interest initiatives more broadly.
Can I address that a bit? Because we're talking a lot about like these national contexts, but the fact is that news is borderless. And we saw that. Let's take one example, specifically the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. What happened? We heard a group of us, Global Forum for Media Development and many other groups that support media organizations, they asked us for lists of trustworthy media from Ukraine, independent trustworthy media from Russia. We put together lists, and now we're trying to actually develop a process whereby we can from a self-regulatory perspective, through our professional bodies, media development organizations, identify media outlets, because when something like that happens, it's a global story. And so those local Ukrainian news outlets are actually relevant all over the world. So I think we do need to step back from this, very precise valuation about the amount of traffic that this publication gets and how much is it worth, because it is more broad. It assists diplomats in doing their work. Myanmar, when the independent media there have to report under extremely dire circumstances, often from abroad, it's very costly, but the diplomatic community depends on that reporting in part to design their foreign policy, design their assistance. So I do think we need to take a step back. And I think it also, the United States needs to take a global role and do something, I think, to regulate these dominant tech platforms that are affecting the public sphere in every country around the world.
Just add to that. It seems to me, Alison, there's two really important axes. When we're thinking about the right intervention, we're thinking, are we looking at legislative or non-legislative? Now, there are some countries where a legislative intervention is problematic because you don't trust the legislature and it's going to lead to political control. And then you're looking at, are we looking at national level or supranational level interventions? Are we looking at regional bodies or global bodies which are best placed? There is some countries where a national level legislative intervention is appropriate. Some of the mature democracies with fairly robust independent institutions, that's where we're looking at bargaining codes. I think there are other countries where that's not going to be the right. We've really heard amazing testimony about countries where that's just going to cause a lot more worries, maybe even than it solves, where we need to be really urgently then looking at supranational, or going to the mothership, going to the US and saying what levers can we pull in a US context, what other legal obligations already exist that could be developed, that could apply to these companies, or what new instruments could be developed in those countries that could really, really have a global impact. So I think you're absolutely right. We need to be a lot more creative about the solution. The bargaining code, as Anya said, it's an important piece of the puzzle. in some times, in some places, but it's not the solution everywhere.
Right, could I just say we've got time for 3 more? I think one Branko at the back, and then Camille. Okay, if we can fit in one more, but Camille would be number 3. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi. My question relates to the strategy of big tech, particularly Google, over the years with the concept of fair use, and in the South African context with our copyright bill process. That has been an exhaustive process. We've seen the behavior of Google in particular in trying to extract a particular outcome in terms of the fair use. The implications being that will have major implications for the livelihoods of authors, of writers, of publishers. And how can countries in the global south learn from our very battered experience in the copyright bill that puts the livelihoods of creatives at a disadvantage, and also the concepts that they promote, such as Creative Commons. All these concepts over the years, on the surface, it sounds very innocent and interesting and free, but when you unpack it, it's actually a very exploitative model, and how this kind of concepts then extract the value and money and sustainability of users, but particularly of the publishing industry.
Let's take all the questions and let's make short questions. And I didn't know if Helena wanted to speak. Branko next. Yeah. And that's it. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you hear me now? Okay, just a very practical question, because we can talk all the principles, but if the compensation amount to 1% of budget makes no difference to us. So when you say 154 million Swiss francs, what is it in comparison with the size of the media, and what kind of injection would it be in the real world? What kind of real difference could it make?
Sorry. Okay. Sorry, Branko.
Thank you so much. Thanks again for all the discussions. That was brilliant. Just have a quick question, because I'm Camille Grenier from the Forum on Information and Democracy. Anytime I hear Google funding or Meta funding, I think about my independence as an NGO. Do you see in these type of fundings and these type of deals some threat to journalistic independence when it gets to covering big tech? A lot of people have mentioned that the role of journalism is to hold political power accountable. It should also hold private powers accountable. Do you see any threats in that, and how can we address this also in the principles? Thank you.
So I think we unfortunately gonna have to cap it now, because we really are eating into our time.
Great. So quick.
Could we just cap it there? Yeah.
Quick responses.
I'll just say on Camille's point, I mean, for me, that's one of the fundamental reasons why transparency is so important, because if we know the terms on which deals have been made, and you're a reader and you look at a news publisher and think they're going very soft on Google, I see they've got a really favorable deal, these ones are going hard, that to me is the biggest mitigation of that what is otherwise a huge threat.
On fair use, I think it's not fair use. I think we have to redefine that. The U.S. Copyright Office was just doing a listening tour to think about how should it consider fair use and copyright with generative AI, and I was really disappointed that there was not a publishers section. There was things for artists, musicians, etc. We need to be very vocal in this discussion. And with respect to Camille's question, I think the platformization is a huge challenge. And in addition to transparency, I don't think that's the end all be all. I think we need to look at how can we separate as much as possible, the direct beneficiary relationship. So, in some countries that might be setting up a third party fund. I think looking at how not just one self-regulatory body, but multiple professional associations, ethical journalism organizations, et cetera, can get together to determine beneficiaries, to set out some of the contours of the agreement so that you separate as far as possible. But I think that is one of the biggest concerns. And I think Taylor Owen said, if you look at the government funding plus the platform funding to the media in Canada, it's upwards of 40% for the two major entities that we need the press to really cover. I mean, that raises deep concerns.
to you, Branko. So what is 154 in a comparison? So it's more than all digital or all publishers make as a revenue from digital. So that's far outlining. It's more than double that they make at the moment. So.
Okay, Branko's in. Excellent.
Okay.
Thank you all for a really fascinating discussion. And I know Michael will come and tell us what we're doing next, but it was great to see everybody. And thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for such an excellent panel. I'm really sorry we had to cut it off because we do obviously have some time constraints. We were meant to end at, start the breakaway groups at 5 to 12. It is now 2 minutes before 12. So let's get yourself into the breakaway groups by 12:15. Let me just give a little bit of background to the breakaway groups, and maybe John could say like a brief word as well. Is that when we put out these principles a week ago or so, or 10 days ago for people to look at, we really wanted to come up with some simple, general principles that could be broadly applicable across jurisdictions. And the idea is that we felt that this was a great opportunity, given the spread of different countries and people involved here, that if we could come up with an agreed set of principles that would take into account most of the challenges here, but without being too specific to exclude people, I think we will have achieved a hell of a lot. And the idea will be is there'll be one breakaway group here. You should have in all your packs, and there's little dots and color coding. There's classroom 1 and classroom 2 out there. And there's a moderator and a scribe for each one of them. The idea would be you would discuss the principles in your different groups. If there's some amendments or suggestions, you would conclude on those to be taken together with the scribes and the moderators, who will meet over lunch, at a working lunch. If they need a bit more time, we will give them a little bit more time because we've got a little bit of extra time built into the next session, with the view that we come back. Hopefully, we were going to come back for lunch at 2 o'clock. But, if it needs to be 2:15 or even 2:20, the idea is to give enough time to come up with a consolidated document that we can come back to this room, and using some of the voting methodology, that we could go through them on the screen and to see if we can all, or most of us, come to an agreement on a set of principles that we could adopt as this conference, publish, and take forward and use in our various campaigns and institutions and continents. So that was the thinking behind it. John, do you want to just add a couple?
There's no need for me to add anything. Michael's just said it all perfectly. Go away and do exactly what he just said.
Yeah. So we've been thinking that it would be good also if we come to agreement to do interviews, op-eds, and other things in the next coming weeks. So that might also be something to think about in your different countries.
Sorry, come in.
When you get to the bus, will you be seeking only endorsement from the organizations that we represent, or it's just
I think we
need to see?
I think we need to talk about strategy in that final meeting.
I think what we'll do is we've got a section called Next Steps. So I think one thing is to agree, then we can have a decision about, because some people might not have mandates from their organizations. So we can decide, do we want people who attend the conference to be signatories or supporters? I think that's a discussion that
we need to decide what is our strategy with these principles and
exactly
do that. Yeah.
So I think the first thing is try and agree on the principles, and then when we do that, let's discuss what the next steps are. How do we popularize them? Who supports them? Who signs them? And I think that's for the final discussion of the day. So that's the thinking. So basically, fantastic panel. Thank you so much. It really, really helped a lot. And let's get into the breakaway groups. I'll give you till 12:15 at the latest to start your discussion. You'll have till 1:15 to finish. Lunch will start then at 1:15. And good luck with the discussion.